Welcome to History Unraveled. Ever stop and think about the lives of the countless people who were absolutely fundamental to the rise and functioning of ancient Rome, yet whose stories often get lost in the grand narratives of emperors and legions?
Hmm.
We see the Colosseum, we hear about senators, but what about the individuals who toiled, often under unimaginable conditions, providing the very foundation for that world?
Yeah, it's easy to overlook them.
Today, we're diving deep into the complex and often brutal reality of slavery in ancient Rome, taking a close look at a range of sources to paint a picture that goes far beyond the simplistic images we often encounter.
Right.
We're here to truly understand what it meant to be enslaved in this powerful civilization.
And it's a crucial exploration because when we talk about Rome, we're talking about a society whose entire structure was, well, intertwined with this institution.
Completely.
Our sources for today give us a really comprehensive view, spanning from the earliest mentions in Roman legal codes right through to the philosophical debates that emerged much later. We'll be examining the origins of slavery in Rome, the astonishingly diverse roles that enslaved people occupied, their legal standing, or perhaps more accurately, their lack of it.
Yeah, the lack of it is key.
Exactly. And even the surprising ways in which some individuals could navigate and, in some cases, even transcend the system. Our goal is to connect the dots for you, to illuminate the inherent contradictions and the very human stories that are embedded within this ancient practice.
Okay, so to really get a handle on this, let's start by grasping just how central slavery was. It wasn't some minor aspect of Roman life. It was the very engine that drove their economy and permeated every level of their society.
Absolutely, the engine.
What immediately strikes you from the material is the sheer breadth of roles that enslaved people filled. It
Yeah.
wasn't just about grueling manual labor in the fields.
Precisely. Our sources make it abundantly clear that we're looking at a vast spectrum of servitude. While, yes, a great many people endured incredibly harsh and physically demanding conditions.
Which we can't forget.
No, definitely not. But others possessed really valuable skills and levels of education that placed them in positions of significant responsibility within Roman households, in various businesses, and even within the machinery of public life.
Right, like administration.
Exactly. Understanding this diversity is absolutely key to grasping the true complexity of Roman slavery and moving beyond simple generalizations.
Let's trace this back to the beginning then and consider the origins of this deeply entrenched system and how it was initially defined, or perhaps more accurately, assumed within Roman law. It seems like even in Rome's earliest days, slavery was just, well, a given.
That's absolutely right. Our sources point us to the 12 tables, which date all the way back to the mid-5th century BC,
Really early.
very early.
Yeah.
And what's telling is that these foundational legal principles don't actually define slavery. Rather, they already assume its existence.
They just bake it in from the start.
Exactly. We see regulations concerning manumission, the act of freeing a slave, and the legal status of those who had been freed, the liberty.
So even then, people were being freed and needing a legal status.
Precisely. The fact that the earliest Roman law was already addressing the status of former slaves indicates that this was a significant population very early on, with established pathways, however limited, towards citizenship and participation in Roman society. It wasn't something new. It was woven into the fabric from the start.
So even in the very foundations of Roman law, this idea of someone transitioning from enslaved to citizen was present. That's pretty significant detail in itself.
It really is.
Later on, we encounter Roman jurists like Gaius and Ulpian, who provide us with more explicit definitions under Spartacus Gentium, the law of nations. What's the nuance there?
What's really thought-provoking is the way they frame it. Gaius, writing in the 2nd century AD, describes slavery under Aelius Gentium as the state in which someone is subject to the dominion of another person contrary to nature.
Contrary to nature, that's quite a statement.
Isn't it? And Ulpian, who lived around the same time, echoes the sentiment, observing that according to natural law, all human beings are born free.
Okay, so natural law says free.
But because slavery was a widespread practice among various peoples and cultures, what the Romans called gentes, individual nations developed their own specific civil laws to govern it.
Ah, so it's like nature says one thing, but common practice and civil law say another.
Exactly. So you see this inherent tension recognized by Roman legal minds. The philosophical idea of a natural right to freedom existing alongside the societal reality of enslavement.
It's a fascinating contradiction at the heart of their legal thinking. And a primary source of this practice, according to Jenny's Gentium, was warfare. The victor held a certain right over the vanquished.
Precisely. The prevailing understanding under Ennius Gentium was that the victor in a war had the right to enslave the defeated population.
So spoils of war, essentially.
In a way, yes. However, there was a generally accepted customary expectation that if a formal settlement was reached through diplomacy or a clear act of surrender, then large-scale enslavement would ideally be avoided. Ideally. It's important to remember that Ennius Gentium wasn't a formally codified set of laws in the way we might think of modern international law, but rather a widely accepted set of international norms of conduct that shaped how different peoples interacted, including in times of conflict.
Got it. Now, what happened to a Roman citizen who found themselves enslaved during wartime? That seems like it would have had profound consequences for their status back home.
It certainly did. According to our sources, a Roman citizen who was enslaved in war essentially lost their citizen rights. They couldn't legally own property. Any existing marriages were considered dissolved.
Wow, dissolved completely.
Yes, and if they were the head of a household, their legal authority over their dependents was suspended. However, the Romans, being the legalistic society they were, developed a fascinating legal process called postliminium to address this very situation.
Postliminium. Okay, that sounds like a really key concept to understand in all of this. What exactly did it entail?
Think of postliminium as a legal mechanism for restoration after a return. It was essentially a way to reintegrate Roman citizens who had been captured and held outside of Roman jurisdiction and then subsequently returned to Roman territory.
So if you made it back.
If a captured Roman citizen managed to be released and set foot back within Roman lands, postliminium allowed for the potential restoration of their previous citizen status, their property rights, and their legal power over their family.
Potential restoration. So not automatic.
Not entirely automatic for everything. Interestingly, any previous marriage wasn't automatically reinstated. A new agreement of consent between the individuals was required.
Okay.
The legal bond had been broken by captivity, so a renewal of that bond needed to be a conscious choice.
That makes sense. The original legal connection had been severed.
Yeah.
But it wasn't an automatic process for every single war captive, was it? There must have been conditions.
Absolutely. The specific terms of a peace treaty, for example, could stipulate that the enemy was allowed to retain certain captives as servi hostium slaves of the enemy.
So tough luck if you were part of that deal.
Pretty much. Ransom was also a common practice, either for individuals or sometimes for entire groups of captives.
Right.
And if someone outside the immediate family paid the ransom for a captured Roman, the freed individual was generally obligated to repay that debt before their full rights and status were completely restored.
So still indebted, even if free.
Until that debt was cleared, their legal standing remained somewhat in limbo.
And it seems the Romans were also quite wary of individuals who might have surrendered too readily in battle. That could impact their eligibility for a postliminium, right?
Precisely. Under the reign of Emperor Hadrian, an investigative procedure was reportedly put in place to try and determine whether returning soldiers had genuinely been captured in battle or if they had surrendered willingly or through acts of cowardice.
So you had to prove you fought honorably.
Essentially, yes. Individuals deemed to be traitors, deserters, or those who had a clear opportunity to escape captivity but failed to take it were not considered eligible for the benefits of postliminium and the automatic restoration of their full citizenship. There was a clear societal value placed on resisting enslavement, even in the face of defeat.
So there was this expectation of resilience and resistance. And postliminium wasn't just applicable to people, was it? It extended to certain types of property as well.
Yes, it did extend to certain categories of mobile property that might have been seized by the enemy, things like horses, mules, and even ships' items that could be lost, without necessarily implying any failure or fault on the owner's part.
Okay, so your horse could get its status back too.
Sort of. And this meant that even enslaved people who were in military support roles and were taken by the enemy could, upon their return to Roman jurisdiction, be brought back into the possession of their former Roman honors and revert to their previous status as slaves.
So for them, postliminium meant returning to slavery.
In that specific context, yes. So it wasn't just about restoring the freedom of citizens, it was also about the restoration of property rights, including human property.
Okay, so that gives us a crucial foundation in terms of the origins and the legal framework surrounding slavery in Rome. Now let's delve into what life was actually like for an enslaved person within Roman society. The most fundamental aspect, as our sources underscore, is the profound lack of libertas, liberty.
Exactly. Liberty, in the Roman context, was fundamentally defined as the absence of servitude. Cicero, in his characteristic way, famously said that liberty isn't about having a just master, but about having no master at all.
Powerful line.
Isn't it? The common everyday term for a slave was service. But legally, when considering a slave as a piece of property, the term used was mancipium.
Ancipium.
This term, which literally translates to something taken in hand, really emphasizes the core concept of ownership and absolute control that a master held over an enslaved person. It highlights the reduction of a human being to a possession.
And certain particularly valuable types of property, including agricultural slaves and the very land they worked on, were categorized as res mancipi. This designation required a very specific and formal legal process for the transfer of ownership, didn't it?
That's right, a formal process called mancipatio. And during the Republican era, this exclusive right to participate in the legal transfer of res mancipi was a really key aspect of Roman citizenship itself.
So only citizens could deal in this prime property, including people.
Generally, yes. Free individuals who were not Roman citizens needed to be granted special commercial rights in order to engage in these more formal and significant transactions involving land and certain types of slaves. It was a marker of full legal capacity.
The sources really paint a stark and often unsettling picture of the legal status of slaves. They were considered property, not legal persons in their own right, and as such could be subjected to incredibly harsh treatment.
Indeed. Under Roman law, slaves could legally be subjected to corporal punishment, including brutal beatings, various forms of sexual exploitation, torture, and even summary execution at the whim of their owners.
Just at the owner's whim.
Essentially. In fact, the harshest and most degrading forms of punishment were often specifically reserved for enslaved people. Their basic well-being was almost entirely dependent on their owner's individual perception of their utility or their value as property.
Utility being the key word there.
Very much so. And this perception could unfortunately fluctuate wildly, ranging from cruel indifference and outright abuse to occasional instances of situational kindness, often motivated by the owner's self-interest rather than genuine empathy.
It's a chilling reminder of the immense power imbalance that was inherent in the system. Yet, despite this almost complete lack of legal standing as individuals, our sources also mention this fascinating legal device known as peculium.
Ah, yes, peculium.
This seems like a really interesting crack in the seemingly absolute power structure, offering a degree of economic agency even to those enslaved.
Peculium was indeed a fascinating and somewhat paradoxical legal loophole within the Roman system of slavery. It essentially allowed slaves, as well as unemancipated sons within a household, to be entrusted with and manage a certain amount of property.
So like a personal fund.
Kind of, yes. They could engage in various economic activities, make profits from those activities, and even enter into and negotiate contracts. Legal texts of the time even draw parallels between the actions of slaves and the actions of sons acting as business agents on behalf of the paterfamilias, the head of the household.
Interesting parallel.
This system of peculium offered a potential pathway for skilled or industrious slaves to gradually accumulate a degree of personal wealth.
And this accumulated wealth could, in some instances, actually lead to their freedom. That must have been a powerful motivator.
Yes. The ultimate hope for many who were granted peculium was that they would eventually be able to save enough money to purchase their own freedom from their masters.
But there was a catch.
Oh, absolutely. It's crucial to remember that the enslaved person always faced the very real risk that their master could, at any point, simply reclaim the accumulated earnings. It was technically still the master's property.
Right, so no real security there initially.
Initially, no. But, importantly, as the Roman legal system evolved, imperial law introduced greater protections in this area. Laws were enacted that allowed agreements for manumission that were tied to the successful accumulation of a certain amount of peculium to be legally enforced.
So they could make it binding later on.
Exactly, offering a greater degree of security to the enslaved person's efforts. Interestingly, freedmen who had a history of successfully managing a peculium often went on to achieve significant financial success and integrate into Roman society. That experience mattered.
It's a remarkable, albeit limited, glimmer of possibility and agency within a very restrictive and often brutal system. Now let's turn our attention to where these vast numbers of enslaved people actually came from. We've already touched on warfare as a major source, but there must have been other significant avenues.
Besides the constant influx of war captives from Rome's numerous military campaigns, another incredibly significant source of enslaved people was simply being born to an enslaved mother.
So, inherited status.
Under Roman law, yes. The legal status of a child followed that of the mother, so children born to enslaved women were themselves considered slaves from birth. These individuals were known as vernae.
Vernae, homeborn slaves.
Correct. Less common and somewhat more legally ambiguous and ethically fraught was the practice of self-sale.
Selling yourself into slavery.
While it was theoretically illegal for a freeborn Roman citizen to sell themselves into slavery, in practice it seems this did occasionally occur, likely driven by extreme poverty and desperation, and might have been sometimes overlooked by authorities unless it was formally challenged.
Self-sale that really speaks to the level of desperation that some free individuals must have faced within Roman society. What of the sheer scale of the slave trade itself? Our sources suggest it was an absolutely massive undertaking.
The precise scale of the Roman slave trade is, unfortunately, quite difficult to determine with absolute accuracy due to the lack of comprehensive and reliable statistical data from the period. It's a real challenge for historians.
Right, no central census bureau tracking this.
Exactly. However, based on various historical accounts and estimations, it is widely believed that hundreds of thousands of new enslaved individuals were needed annually across the vast Roman Empire.
Hundreds of thousands a year.
That's the estimate, yes. Just to maintain and, in many areas, to grow the existing enslaved population, given the high mortality rates and low birth rates within the slave community.
Wow.
Various regions across the known world supplied enslaved people to Rome. Those captured in Rome's extensive military campaigns throughout Europe, North Africa, and the East were a primary source.
Okay, so conquest is huge.
Absolutely. Additionally, widespread piracy, particularly in the Mediterranean Sea, was a significant and persistent source of enslaved individuals, with people being captured and sold into slavery throughout the region.
Pirates too, so it wasn't just state-sanctioned warfare.
No, it was a messy business. Kidnapping by bandits or pirates was technically illegal and didn't automatically result in loss of Roman citizenship if you were captured that way. But getting back could be another story.
So it was a truly international and deeply ingrained enterprise that spanned the entire Mediterranean world. And how were these individuals actually bought and sold? What did the process look like?
Formal slave markets certainly existed in Rome and other major centers throughout the empire, and enslaved people were regularly sold at public auctions.
Public auctions. Like livestock.
Unfortunately, yes. Their physical appearance, any known skills or talents they possessed, and their region of origin could all significantly influence their market value.
So origin mattered, like from Gaul or from Syria.
It could, yes. Sometimes associated with certain stereotypes or perceived skills. Sellers would sometimes offer warranties or guarantees regarding the health and capabilities of the individuals being sold.
Warranties on people.
Yes, and this was symbolically indicated by the absence of a pileus, a felt cap, worn by the slave at the auction, if they wore the cap.
No guarantee.
Exactly. The presence of the pileus signaled to potential buyers that the seller was offering no guarantees regarding the slave's condition or temperament. It was a stark and dehumanizing process, treating human beings as commodities to be inspected and traded.
It's a really unsettling image. Human beings being bought and sold with warranties, much like any other form of merchandise.
Yeah.
Our sources even offer a fascinating anecdote about Julius Caesar's own encounter with pirates that really highlights the prevalence of this practice.
Yes, it's a remarkable story. As a young and ambitious man, Julius Caesar was once captured by Seleucian pirates.
The future dictator himself?
The very same. Recognizing his apparent importance, though perhaps underestimating his future influence, they initially set his ransom at a sum of 20 talents of silver.
Okay.
However, the famously self-assured Caesar reportedly scoffed at this amount and insisted they raise it to 50 talents, believing his worth to be considerably higher.
He negotiated his own ransom up.
That's the story. He spent 38 days in captivity with these pirates. Upon his eventual release, after his ransom was paid, Caesar, true to his word, is said to have returned with a naval force, captured his former captors, and had them all crucified.
Whoa.
A particularly brutal form of execution that was typically reserved for slaves and the most heinous criminals in Roman society. It's a powerful illustration of both the widespread nature of piracy and enslavement at the time, and the ruthlessness of Roman justice, even from someone who'd experienced captivity.
A truly striking example of the brutal realities of the era, and how even someone destined for immense power could experience the vulnerability of captivity. Interestingly, our sources also shed light on how different communities within the Roman world viewed the enslavement of individuals from their own cultural or religious groups.
That's a really crucial and often overlooked point. Within the Jewish community living under Roman rule, for example, rabbinic teachings generally encourage the ransoming of enslaved Jews from non-Jewish owners.
A communal obligation.
Yes, but there was also a significant concern about inadvertently incentivizing further enslavement. Therefore, rabbinical authorities often advised against paying more than the prevailing market value for a captive.
Why was that?
Fearing that inflated ransom prices would simply encourage Romans and others to enslave even more Jewish people for profit, it was a difficult balance.
A grim calculation.
Similarly, in the early Christian church, ransoming fellow Christians who had been taken captive was considered a significant act of charity and a moral imperative.
So religious communities tried to look after their own.
As the Roman Empire gradually came under Christian rule, we see instances of Christian churches and wealthy individuals expending considerable funds to buy back Christian prisoners who had been enslaved, particularly during periods of conflict or persecution. These examples highlight the inherent moral tensions and the communal bonds that could exist even within the broader context of a slave-owning society.
It really underscores the complex ethical landscape of the time, with these pockets of resistance and communal support existing within the larger framework of widespread enslavement. Now let's shift our focus to the daily lives of these enslaved people and the astonishing variety of work they performed. It was far from a uniform experience, wasn't it?
Absolutely not. The daily lives and the types of work undertaken by enslaved people in ancient Rome were incredibly diverse, reflecting the vast and complex nature of Roman society and its economy.
Right.
At one end of the spectrum, you had individuals engaged in grueling and often deadly unskilled labor in agricultural fields, in mines extracting precious metals, and in mills grinding grain. These were often the most brutal conditions, with very little hope for any improvement in their circumstances or eventual freedom.
The mines especially sound horrific.
They were notorious. But at the other end, you had highly skilled slaves who worked as artisans in various crafts, as cooks and other domestic staff in wealthy households, as entertainers like musicians and actors.
Business managers, too, you mentioned.
Yes. Business managers overseeing complex financial affairs, accountants, bankers managing large sums of money, educators tutoring the children of the elite, secretaries and scribes responsible for correspondence and record-keeping.
Wow, quite the range.
Even civil servants within the imperial administration, and, as you might find surprising, even as physicians and medical practitioners.
An enslaved physician. That image really challenges the common perception we might have. It highlights just how much skills and knowledge could transcend the legal status of a person.
It really does. It underscores the fact that in Roman society, practical skills and education held significant value, regardless of whether the person possessing them was legally free or enslaved.
Skills were valuable currency, in a way.
Very much so. In wealthy Roman households in particular, you could find a remarkable degree of specialization among the enslaved workforce, with individual slaves dedicated to very specific tasks, from hairdressing and laundry to teaching languages, managing household accounts, and even providing medical care.
A whole specialized staff.
Some particularly wealthy and entrepreneurial owners might even choose to lease out their skilled slaves to others for a fee, or allow them to operate their own small shops or businesses as part of their peculium, essentially functioning as mini enterprises within the larger household or estate.
So a large Roman household could essentially function like a small, self-sufficient business, with its enslaved workforce providing a wide range of specialized services. What about the relationship between free labor and enslaved labor? Did they typically work alongside each other in various occupations?
Our sources indicate that in many occupations across the Roman world, Both free individuals working for wages and enslaved people toiled side by side.
So a mix was common.
Yes, although the specific proportions of each would have varied considerably depending on the nature of the work, the location, and the time period in question.
Right.
Interestingly, many Roman elites whose wealth and social standing were primarily based on land ownership and the labor it generated often drew a rather cynical parallel between being enslaved and being dependent on wage labor as a free worker.
Yeah, so.
In their eyes, both were essentially forms of economic dependence and submission to the will of another, blurring the lines between our modern understanding of free and unfree labor. It was a perspective rooted in their hierarchical worldview.
That perspective really challenges our modern, often idealized understanding of the distinction between free and unfree labor. It seems the Roman social hierarchy had a very different set of underlying assumptions.
Very different, yes.
And it's also quite interesting to learn that Roman legal texts actually included certain protections aimed at preventing the misuse of a slave's specific skills and talents.
Yes, there were indeed legal regulations, although the extent to which they were effectively enforced in practice is perhaps debatable.
Always the question of enforcement.
These regulations aim to prevent a master from completely disregarding a slave's particular abilities and forcing them into entirely unrelated and potentially degrading work. Examples cited in legal texts include prohibitions against forcing a highly trained stage actor to work as a common bath attendant,
Okay, that makes sense.
or compelling a professional athlete known for their physical prowess to clean latrines, or making a skilled scribe perform heavy manual labor in the countryside.
So protecting the investment, in a way.
Partly, yes. These regulations, however limited in their practical impact, do suggest a recognition within Roman society that a slave's skills held a certain value that shouldn't be wantonly wasted.
What about those who toiled in agriculture? We often picture vast numbers of enslaved people working the land. What was their experience typically like?
Agricultural slaves certainly constituted a very large segment of the enslaved population in Roman society, and by many accounts they often endured exceptionally harsh and demanding working conditions on large agricultural estates, the latifundia.
Right, the big estates.
They frequently lived in rudimentary and overcrowded housing, sometimes even in what were known as ergastula, essentially fortified slave prisons or workhouses, particularly if they were considered a flight risk or were being punished.
Ergastula, work prisons.
Very grim. The writings of figures like Cato the Elder provide a particularly stark illustration of a very frugal, utilitarian, and often brutal view of farm slaves, where they were treated primarily as instruments of production with little regard for their individual well-being.
Just cogs in the agricultural machine.
That's a fair description of his attitude, yes.
And beyond private ownership, the Roman state itself employed large numbers of enslaved people, didn't it? What kind of roles did they fill?
Yes, the imperial administration and various branches of public service also relied heavily on enslaved labor. State-owned slaves, known as servi publici, were employed in a wide range of administrative tasks.
Like clerks and record keepers.
Exactly, as well as in more physically demanding roles in state-run mines and quarries. Mining, in particular, was often an exceptionally brutal and dangerous form of labor, and it frequently served as a form of penal servitude for both condemned criminals and enslaved individuals.
So a death sentence in many cases.
Often, yes. Those working in mines could even be tattooed for identification purposes. Additionally, enslaved individuals were also employed as galley slaves, powering the oars of Roman naval vessels.
The classic image of the galley slave.
Indeed. Interestingly, despite their lack of personal freedom, slaves owned by the state, servi publici, did possess some limited rights that were generally not afforded to privately owned slaves.
Oh, like what?
For example, they often had the ability to manage their own peculium, and in some cases were even able to make arrangements that resembled wills, designating who might receive their accumulated property upon their death.
So slightly better off maybe than being privately owned in some respects.
Potentially, in certain legal aspects, yes, it shows the variation.
So even within the harsh and dehumanizing reality of slavery, there were variations and nuances in the experiences depending on who owned them, the type of work they performed, and even whether they were owned by a private individual or by the Roman state itself. Let's turn to a particularly human aspect of this, the formation of families and social bonds among enslaved people. What does our material reveal about this?
While Roman law, reflecting its fundamental view of slaves as property, did not formally recognize slave marriages, the relationships they formed were referred to as contubernium, not matrimonium.
Condiburnum, so like a cohabitation, not illegal marriage.
Exactly. But our sources make it quite clear that enslaved individuals did indeed form deep and meaningful relationships and create families.
Despite the lack of legal recognition.
Absolutely. Although these familial bonds lacked legal sanction, owners sometimes did acknowledge and respect these connections, particularly among slaves who were valued for their loyalty and productivity. It could be pragmatic for the owner, too.
Right, keep people stable.
Possibly. We also find poignant evidence of affection and commemoration in surviving epitaphs and funerary inscriptions dedicated to enslaved partners and family members, suggesting a deep level of emotional connection despite the legal barriers.
Those epitaphs must be quite moving.
They really are. They offer a glimpse into the personal lives often hidden by the legal framework.
The children born to enslaved women, the vernae, were themselves immediately considered slaves. What do our sources tell us about their lives and experiences?
The lives of Vune were, of course, shaped by their enslaved status from birth. Some owners, perhaps recognizing their potential future value or out of a sense of paternalism, did choose to foster or adopt exposed infants.
Exposed infants, you mean abandoned babies?
Yes, infants left exposed, which was unfortunately common. Sometimes owners would take them in, even those who were not born into their own slave households, viewing it perhaps as an investment in future labor.
An investment. Grim.
Training for skilled work often began in early adolescence for these children. Child slaves were employed in a wide variety of trades and domestic roles, often performing lighter tasks suited to their age and physical capabilities.
So childhood wasn't really protected.
Not in the way we think of it. It's quite striking that the common Latin term pure could refer to either a boy who was freeborn or a male slave, highlighting how the lines could be blurred in everyday language and even in artistic representations.
Language reflecting the reality.
And the concept of alumni referred to children who were exposed but then taken in and raised by others, often remaining in a dependent status within the household that took them in, without necessarily being formally enslaved, but also without the full rights of freeborn children, a sort of gray area.
It's a really poignant reminder of the profound human cost of this system, the way it disrupted natural family structures and imposed a legal status from birth that could dictate an entire life. Now, let's turn to the possibility of escape from this system. The process of manumission, and what happened to those individuals who successfully gained their freedom.
Manumission, the formal act of granting freedom to a slave, was a significant and relatively common aspect of Roman slavery, leading to a substantial and influential population of freedmen known as liberti.
Liberty. The freed one.
Exactly. Various methods of manumission existed, ranging from formal legal ceremonies conducted in front of magistrates to more informal declarations of freedom by the owner.
So different ways to gain freedom.
Yes. Upon being freed, a former slave became a Roman citizen, but their citizenship often came with certain obligations and limitations in relation to their former masters, who now became their patrons.
Patrons, so still tied to the old master.
Yes. These obligations could include continued labor for a set period, expressions of loyalty, and various forms of deference. It wasn't always a clean break.
So achieving freedom wasn't necessarily a complete and clean break from the past. There were still significant ties and obligations to the former owner, but social mobility was still a possibility for freedmen, wasn't it? Some were able to rise quite significantly in Roman society.
Yes, while they often faced social prejudice due to their former status being called an ex-slave, wasn't a compliment. Some liberty did indeed achieve considerable wealth, social standing, and even political influence in Roman society, particularly during the imperial period.
Especially in business, right?
Often, yes. However, they were never quite on equal footing with those who were born free, the ingenui. There was always a distinction.
And that felt cap, the pileus.
Ah, yes, the pileus. That felt cap we mentioned earlier as a sign of no guarantee at slave auctions also served as a powerful symbol of freedom. It was traditionally worn by newly freed slaves during the manumission ceremony and sometimes afterwards.
A symbol of their new status.
Precisely. The legal status of freedmen evolved over time with various laws, such as the Lex Iunia Norbana, granting a kind of intermediate Latin status with certain but not all of the rights of full Roman citizenship. It was complex.
Layers of status.
And eventually, the Constitutio Antoniana in 212 AD extended Roman citizenship citizenship to most free inhabitants of the empire, which included a great many freedmen, significantly broadening their legal rights overall.
It paints a complex picture of moving from enslavement to citizenship, with varying degrees of integration, continued obligations, and evolving legal rights for those who were manumitted. Of course, not everyone accepted their enslaved fate passively. Our sources also touch upon the realities of resistance and flight.
Fugitive slaves were indeed viewed as criminals under Roman law, guilty of what was essentially considered stealing their owner's property themselves.
Stealing themselves. What a concept.
It perfectly encapsulates the legal view. The capture and return of runaway slaves was a significant focus of police activity, involving various levels of Roman authority.
Slave catchers were a real thing.
Oh, absolutely. Rewards were frequently offered for the apprehension and return of runaways, and it was common practice to post public advertisements containing detailed descriptions of escaped slaves to aid in their recapture.
Like wanted posters.
Exactly like that. The ever-present fear of large-scale slave revolts, a fear vividly stoked by the memory of the earlier servile wars.
Like Spartacus.
Precisely. That memory undoubtedly contributed to the often harsh and brutal treatment meted out to those who attempted to flee their bondage. They wanted to make examples.
It's a stark reminder that the enslaved were not simply passive victims of the system. They actively sought freedom and resisted their bondage in a variety of ways, even at great personal risk. Our sources even offer a really fascinating story, popularized through Aesop's fables, that touches on this theme, the tale of Androclus and the lion.
Ah, the Androclus story. Yes, the well-known tale, which was retold by the Roman writer Aulus Gellius, provides a compelling narrative of unexpected mercy and even kindness shown towards a fugitive slave.
How did it go again?
According to the story, Androclus, who had endured harsh treatment and beatings from his cruel master, managed to escape. While on the run, he came across a lion in distress, suffering from a painful wound. Showing compassion, Androclus bravely removed a large thorn from the lion's paw, relieving its agony. Years later, Androclus was eventually captured, returned to his master, and condemned to be thrown to wild animals in the arena as punishment.
A typical punishment for runaways.
Yes. However, the very lion that was released to attack him turned out to be the same one he had helped in the wilderness. Recognizing his former benefactor, the lion refused to harm Androclus, much to the amazement of the crowd and the emperor.
Wow.
The emperor, hearing Androclus's story, was so moved that he granted the slave his freedom. It's a powerful story that touches on themes of desperation, escape, the harsh realities of punishment, and the universal longing for mercy and freedom, all set within the context of a Roman slave's experience.
It's a truly powerful anecdote that speaks to the enduring human desire for compassion and freedom, even in the most brutal of circumstances. This naturally leads us to the complex and often contradictory question of morality and the treatment of slaves within Roman society. It certainly wasn't a monolithic viewpoint, was it?
Not at all. Roman morality concerning slavery was deeply complex and often riddled with contradictions. While enslaved people were legally defined as property, the concept of humanitas, a sense of humaneness and consideration, was sometimes invoked by Roman thinkers and writers, urging more humane treatment of slaves.
Humanitas. But did it mean much in practice?
That's the key question. It's crucial to understand that the prevailing societal view did not necessarily place a high intrinsic value on the life or well-being of an individual slave. Their value was primarily economic or practical.
So humanitas might mean don't needlessly damage your property.
Often, yes, that practical element was there. Moral perspectives on slavery ranged from philosophical justifications, such as Aristotle's argument that some people were naturally suited to be slaves.
A natural slave argument.
Right, and the utilitarian argument that slavery provided significant cultural and economic benefits to Roman society. These were common justifications. On the other hand, you had much rarer voices that condemned the institution as inherently unjust and morally repugnant.
But those were rare.
Very rare. More common were criticisms of specific abuses within the system, such as the wrongful enslavement of free individuals or excessive cruelty. And there was a general recognition that slaves, despite their legal status, were still human beings and thus deserving of at least some degree of consideration, even if that consideration was often based more on the owner's self-interest in maintaining a productive workforce than on genuine empathy.
So criticizing the abuse, not necessarily the system itself.
Much more common, yes.
Our sources provide some really stark examples of both extreme brutality and instances where even those in positions of great power intervened against particularly egregious cruelty. The anecdote Seneca recounts about Vitius Pollio and the broken crystal cup is particularly striking and unsettling.
Yes, Seneca the Younger recounts a chilling incident involving the wealthy Roman knight Vitius Pollio. In the presence of Emperor Augustus himself, Pollio ordered a slave who had accidentally broken a crystal cup to be thrown into a pond filled with carnivorous lampreys to be eaten alive as punishment.
Man, praise. That's horrific.
Truly. The young slave, in his desperate fear, threw himself at Augustus's feet, pleading for a less horrific death. Augustus, witnessing this extreme cruelty firsthand, was reportedly moved to intervene.
Thank goodness.
He ordered the boy to be released, the remaining crystal cups in Pollio's possession to be broken, and the lamprey pond to be filled in.
Making quite a statement there.
Indeed. This incident, while horrifying in its depiction of the potential for extreme brutality that slave owners could wield, also highlights rare instances where even the highest authorities in Rome could be moved by what they perceived as excessive and unjustified cruelty and were willing to exert their power to prevent it. Seneca uses this very tale in his writings to critique the lack of mercy and the excessive indulgence and anger that some slave owners displayed.
It seems that Roman law itself even acknowledged the extreme despair that the brutal realities of slavery could inflict, even to the point of acknowledging the possibility of slaves attempting suicide.
Yes, the fact that a slave's attempted suicide was something that legally had to be disclosed in sales contracts for enslaved individuals indicates that it was a recognized concern within Roman society.
Something a buyer needed to know.
Exactly. However, the legal view on slave suicide was not straightforward. A distinction was generally made between suicide that was perceived as being motivated by wickedness or the commission of a crime, and suicide that was seen as an act of desperation, a release from unbearable pain and suffering.
A grim distinction.
The latter was often viewed with perhaps a degree more understanding, or at least as a factor that a potential buyer should be aware of when assessing the value and potential risk associated with purchasing a particular enslaved person.
It's a grim but important distinction that reflects the complex and often contradictory attitudes towards enslaved people. And despite the severe legal limitations placed on slaves' rights and autonomy, some masters did, on occasion, allow informal arrangements that resembled wills for their enslaved property.
That's true, similar to the servi publica we mentioned, and there was also a recognized moral conflict within Roman society regarding the practice of forcing slaves into prostitution.
Right, that must have been common.
Unfortunately, yes. But legal covenants, known as ne serva prostituatur, were sometimes included in the contracts when female slaves were sold.
Meaning, the female slave is not to be prostituted.
Precisely. These covenants were specifically designed to prevent the new owner from forcing the slave into prostitution. If such a covenant was violated, the enslaved woman could potentially be granted her freedom, even if the buyer claimed to have been unaware of the original restriction.
So some legal recourse against that specific abuse.
Some, yes. This legal provision demonstrates a clear awareness within Roman society of the particular moral implications and the inherent injustice of forcing an enslaved person into sexual exploitation for profit.
Finally, our sources also mention the recurring figure of the trickster slave in Roman literature, particularly in comedies. What role did these characters play in reflecting the complex master-slave relationship?
The clever slave. The character of the clever and resourceful trickster slave was a very popular trope in Roman comedic literature, especially plays adapted from Greek New Comedy.
Like in Plautus's plays.
Exactly. These characters often served as a temporary subversion of the established social order within the plays. They frequently outsmarted their masters, manipulated situations to their own advantage, and essentially created a kind of topsy-turvy world within the comedic narrative where the typically powerless slave held a temporary upper hand.
Wish fulfillment for the audience, maybe.
Perhaps partly. While these characters often faced the threat of severe punishment if their schemes were discovered, they typically managed to escape through their wit and cunning. Their prevalence in Roman comedy likely reflected the underlying tensions, anxieties, and complexities inherent in the master-slave dynamic within Roman society.
A way to laugh about the uncomfortable realities.
Offering a form of catharsis and perhaps even a subtle commentary on the existing power structures, all safely contained within the genre of comedy.
So as we surface from this deep dive into the world of Roman slavery, it's abundantly clear that it was far more than just a simple system of chains and back-breaking labor.
Far more complex.
It was a multifaceted and deeply ingrained institution that permeated Roman law, economics, social structures, and even the moral and philosophical debates of the time. You've seen how enslaved people occupied an astonishingly wide spectrum of roles.
From mines to mansions, literally.
Exactly. From the most brutal and dehumanizing to positions of considerable responsibility and even influence, and how the possibility of manumission, though often fraught with continued obligations, offered a unique and significant aspect to Roman servitude compared to some other slave systems.
That possibility of freedom, however conditional, is a really key feature of the Roman system.
What's particularly fascinating here is the inherent contradiction that lay at the very heart of Roman society. How could a civilization that prided itself on its advancements in law, governance, and even philosophy reconcile itself with the widespread ownership and exploitation of other human beings?
It's the central paradox, isn't it? That concept of humanitas bumping up against the reality of mancipium.
This fundamental tension raises a really important question for you, our listeners, to consider long after our discussion today. How do the echoes of this ancient system, with all its complexities, its moral ambiguities, and its enduring impact on ideas of labor, freedom, and human rights, still resonate in our understanding of the world today?
It's a heavy question, but an important one. Thinking about how societies justify inequality, how economic systems rely on different forms of labor, how legal status defines personhood.
Think about the intricate legal definitions that sought to define who was a person and who was property, the immense economic reliance that fueled an entire empire, the profound social implications that shaped every aspect of Roman life, and even the individual acts of resistance and the yearning for freedom that punctuated this long history.
There is truly so much more to explore within this vast and often unsettling topic. The sources are rich if you dig into them.
Perhaps your own further investigations will uncover even more nuances and make connections that we haven't even touched upon today. Until our next deep dive into the past, keep questioning, keep exploring the complexities of history.